Hi, everyone. We'll just give it a minute while people are joining. Good morning, good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. I'm Allison Jordan, Executive Director of the California Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance. And on behalf of all the partner organizations, I'd like to welcome you to day 3 of the U.S. Sustainable Wine Growing Summit. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping notes. First, please use the Q&A section to ask questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can, and we will plan to respond to the remaining questions after the event. We'll share this along with the link to the recording. And also, please use the chat section to interact with all panelists and attendees, or just the panelists, and you can toggle between the two. We'd like to thank all of our sponsors who stepped up and supported the event. Our exclusive media sponsor, American Vineyard Magazine, Deep Planet, AA Vineyards, Heron Hill Winery, Napa Green, Protected Harvest, and TerraView. We have a great couple of hours planned for you with fantastic speakers to help lend their perspectives to two very topical sustainability issues. And I'd now like to welcome Sam Filler, Executive Director of the New York Wine and Grape Foundation, another one of our great partners on this U.S. Sustainability Initiative. And he's going to introduce you to the next panel. Over to you,
Thanks,
Sam.
Allison. Thank you. And I think I'll say happy Wednesday, since we have a bi-coastal and international audience. And I'm coming to you here from New York. And we're pleased to be a partner of this summit, along with Long Island Sustainable Wine Growing. We were hoping we could greet you here in New York. So if you want to close your eyes and imagine staring out to Peconic Bay, and you have a platter of oysters and maybe Rich's Albarino in the glass, or a Cayuga White from Hunt Country Vineyards, or a Gewürztraminer from Heron Hill, we'll be excited to welcome you anytime in the future, and show you what we're doing here in New York. I think I have to give a lot of credit to Allison, because when I started in this role as an executive director in 2017, I think she sent me an email, and then we had a phone call in the spring, and she's like, "Hey, we're putting together this grant. We want to include you guys." And I was like, I don't have my head screwed on yet, but I know sustainability is going to be very important for the future of our industry. So count us in. And I think it helped that Long Island Sustainable Wine Growing was a partner too, because they're our leader here in the state in terms of certification. So it has instigated a lot of good things here in New York. First thing we did is we created a sustainability award as part of our annual Unity Awards. And that sort of put a bug in John Engel, who's the owner of Heron Hill Vineyards, to convene a group of growers in the Finger Lakes to see how they could revive our vine balance workbook, which was based off of Lodi rules. And then we recognized the Hunt family at Hunt Country Vineyards as our Sustainable Winery of the Year 2 years ago. And so Suzanne has been part of our group, pioneering and leading the charge for a sustainability program here in New York. And so I'm happy to share, and we were hoping to make this a bigger announcement, having it in person in New York. We received a USDA Conservation Innovation Grant that's going to allow us to launch a statewide sustainability program here in New York. We're going to be hiring our first staff person to run that program, and we're going to be kicking things off in May. So our partnership in this summit and the other work that's gone behind it has really helped us energize our industry, and get going with our own certification program here in New York. So I think the best part of this is it takes a village. And so the village being all our key U.S. wine regions, and it's become very clear that climate smart wine growing, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation, is an issue that we can all work on together. And so I know CSWA has just launched a really exciting United website that we're all part of. There's the brochure that you may have received in your tasting kit for the tasting on Monday. So it's great to be united together in this effort. And I look forward to the continued work we're going to be doing to improve our wine regions, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase carbon sequestration, and really be, I think, a model for the U.S. agricultural industry of what it looks like to have a clear goal for sustainability in the wine industry. But the associations, we're doing all the behind the scenes work, but it's really the wine growers and the vintners who they touch the land, they touch the wine, and they're really the ones who best understand climate change resiliency. So I'm excited to introduce this next session, which will offer wine grower perspectives on climate change and how they're taking action in response. And I'm excited to hear from our very own Suzanne Hunt. And I'm equally excited to welcome Esther Mobley, wine critic for the San Francisco Chronicle. And she's covered this subject in depth and will be moderating the session. You can find Esther's bio and the other panelists' bios via the link in the chat or on the Summit webpage. And just as a reminder, as with the other sessions, please use the Q&A section to ask questions. I know it's tempting to jump into the chat section, but Q&A is the best place to put your questions so everyone can see them. And so if we don't get to all the questions, we definitely will be getting you answers after the summit. And without further ado, Esther, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam, and welcome everyone. We're excited to have you all here today. And I think it's a really exciting opportunity to hear from three folks in the industry who represent a real range of geographic locations, but also different approaches to tackling this very big issue. So we're here to talk about climate change. I suspect you're all here because you care about climate change, and because we all know that climate change poses a real grave threat, maybe the gravest threat to not only our planet, our lives, the lives of other creatures, but also to the enterprise of wine making and grape growing. We know that warmer temperatures are changing what our wines taste like. They may be creating dangerous working environments for workers. We know that pests are posing threats to vineyards that weren't always there. We've got it all. We've got erratic weather patterns and drought cycles, and as we know all too well here in California, increasingly frequent mega fires that are disrupting what in this state alone is a $40 billion industry. So it's pretty easy to feel despondent about it all. And to tell you the truth, as the other panelists and I were discussing this, it wasn't always a hopeful conversation. But we are actually, I think, in a very hopeful moment. And I think that our conversation today can underscore that. Just today, we've learned that President Biden is going to announce a plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by half by the end of this decade. I think that's an exciting, ambitious goal that represents a kind of great systemic process that is going to be undertaken. And I also think it's a really hopeful moment because we know that as much as agriculture wineries may sometimes in the past have contributed to some of the problems, we now see many ways in which they can be a big part of the solution. I, as a journalist covering the way that climate change intersects with the wine industry, have been really inspired over the last few years to talk to growers, winemakers, and scientists, to hear about commitments to biodiversity, new technologies, our ever deepening understanding of the importance of regenerative agriculture, and the opportunity that the wine industry has, maybe uniquely among agricultural industries, to spread the word about all of this work. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the panel. And I'm gonna let each of them just speak briefly and tell you all a little bit about themselves, what they do, and give you a little bit of a snippet about what we're going to discuss when we get into the question period. So first we have Nadine, who's the ranch manager at Soter Vineyards in Oregon.
Hi, everybody. As Esther said, I'm the ranch manager in Carlton, Oregon at Soter Vineyards. We're in the Willamette Valley in the Pacific Northwest. And we have here a 240-acre diversified biodynamic and organic ranch where we grow 40 acres of primarily Pinot Noir and a little bit of Chardonnay. We make a sparkling wine and a still Pinot and various other variations of that. We also run a vegetable farm, a hay operation, a livestock operation. We grow grain on this property. We manage forests. We have, on our 200 acres that are not in wine grapes, we have a very diverse, yeah, someone in the chat is saying roosters. We got roosters running around outside making a lot of noise. We have a very diverse offering on this property that dovetails into our hospitality experience with a farm to table style restaurant that we greet our customers with at the tasting room. So I think I'm here on the panel to discuss biodiversity and also various growing techniques that might help combat climate change, although that's a big task. But mostly I'm here to answer questions about growing organic and biodynamic wine grapes with low input and low water usage. So that's me.
Thanks, Nadine. And next up, we have Julien, who is the Vice President of Sustainability for Jackson Family Wines. He's based in California.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Julien Gervreau. I'm, excuse me, delighted to be here. And just as a high-level overview for Jackson Family Wines, we're a family-owned and operated wine company based in Sonoma County, Northern California, with vineyard operations up and down the coast of California from Santa Barbara County in the south up to the north coast, Mendocino, Sonoma, Napa, Lake counties, and then also in Oregon in the Willamette Valley. We've also got a few estates sprinkled across what have historically been some of the best wine growing regions in the world, including Tuscany and Bordeaux and South Australia. For us, sustainability has been really, I think, a family passion since the founding of the company in the late 1970s, early 1980s. We really kind of talk a lot about just the intergenerational commitment that the Jackson family has to sustainability in general. And I think that aligns really nicely with the triple bottom line, people, planet, profit. That's essentially espoused through programs like the Certified California Sustainable Wine Growing Program, which we've been a member of for all of our vineyards and wineries since 2010. And in more recent years, really starting in about 2008, we've become increasingly concerned with climate impacts and understanding, I think, our own organizational impact, measuring our emissions, which we've been doing since 2008, and then working to figure out how we can actually take some decisive action to reduce our impacts, reduce our emissions, essentially in line with what the science is requiring. And so I'm looking forward to sharing some of the activities that we have put into place over the last few years, in particular since about 2014, 2015. We've seen about a 17.5% reduction in our overall greenhouse gas emissions footprint as a result of a number of mitigative efforts, including renewable energy, glass bottle lightweighting, things like that. And then I'm also excited to just kind of talk about where we're headed. We've had a lot of time over the last year and a half to think through what the legacy we want to leave as agricultural producers, as a family-owned company, and how that aligns with some of our areas of highest materiality: climate, water resiliency, farming, land use, and social impact. So delighted to be on the panel today. I think this is a timely and relevant topic of discussion, and really, really excited to see the wine industry leading on climate action.
Thank you. And then last but not least, we have Suzanne, who is the co-owner and director of sustainability at Hunt Country Vineyards in New York.
Hi, everybody. So we are a 7th generation family farm and 40-year-old winery in the Finger Lakes. Since many of you might not know us, I thought I might run through a number of and just touch some high points on the various aspects of sustainability that we've tackled over the years. I realize in 5 minutes, I'm gonna run out of time to touch on all of them. So I think, in addition to hopefully having time to talk about what we're doing in the vineyards, what we're doing in terms of soil health, energy efficiency, renewables, EVs, and all of those nuts and bolts things, I'm also hoping we have time to talk about industry leadership, community engagement, but especially customer education and advocacy and activism as an industry. So as this whole event has highlighted, we are uniquely under threat, and our beloved vinifera grapes are uniquely under threat in the agricultural world due to climate change. So I think that is the perfect mandate for us to come together as an industry and use our power and our voice as an important business community with our political leaders to change the conversation and help build the momentum. And it's just such an important time for policy and climate policy now. And if we've learned anything from this pandemic experience, it's that these are huge systemic problems. Like the whole world stopped and greenhouse gas emissions reductions were not that significant. So our individual business actions, our individual, and even our industry actions are not enough to get the amount of action and the scale of action and speed of action that's needed so that my nieces and nephews can enjoy and grow vinifera in the Finger Lakes. So having gotten that off my chest, maybe I'll just run through a few things. I was excited to hear folks talking about Lipco sprayers yesterday. We purchased one of those last year. We're really excited about that in the vineyard. We have certified some of our vineyards organic. I would love to cross-pollinate with anyone who's trying to grow organic vines in the Northeast. We are doing a whole lot on soil health. That's one of my favorite things to talk about. Hopefully we'll get into soil health and soil carbon. We make compost. My brother started a whole composting business. We make biochar. We have a research project that we're starting this year with our local soil and water department to look at the impacts and do a whole bunch of soil testing of large scale compost and biochar addition to both our hay fields and some of our vineyards. We haven't used synthetic fertilizers for many years. We use, in addition to the compost, animal manures. We grow and use hay as mulch. We round bale and then roll it out between the rows. I'll just skip around because I can't touch on all of it. Lots of energy efficiency work. Sometimes we're on the cutting edge and sometimes we're on the bleeding edge. About 10 years ago, we put in a small vertical axis demonstration wind turbine and it never worked very well. We now have hundreds and hundreds of solar panels that produce most of our electricity, and that wind turbine is now a really lovely raptor perch that gets used often. We have geothermal heating and cooling for all the large buildings. We put in 5 EV chargers last year, so we provide free charging for our customers. I was really excited to hear about the Monarch electric tractors yesterday. We have an electric gator, but didn't know we could put an order in for tractors yet. Habitat it was nice to hear some of the wineries yesterday talking about providing walking trails for their employees and well-being. And we also grow organic veggies and flowers for events and family and staff. Gosh, I'm going to stop there because I'm guessing I'm running up on my 5 minutes, but I think the last thing I would just say is water is I know it's a big issue out west. And one of the beautiful things about the soil organic matter and the soil carbon conversation is that while we're helping with resilience and soil health through those actions, we're also helping make our farms and vineyards into sponges so that when we get these dramatic rain events that we've been getting in New York, we don't have the runoff. And we also are helping to recharge the aquifer. So a lot of these issues are intersectional and reinforce each other.
Thank you, Suzanne. So there's a lot to cover, clearly. Nadine, I want to start with you and give us, I want to get a view into what you are doing as it relates to biodiversity and regenerative farming. I mean, you're a longtime practitioner of organic and biodynamic farming, but what are you doing now specifically with climate change in mind, and what impacts are you seeing it making so far? We got to get you unmuted, Nadine. There you go.
Suzanne touched on a lot of different practices that are fantastic for all sorts of regenerative agriculture, whether it is organic, biodynamic, or sustainable. I think where we are headed now, where we really see the future of being able to build soil carbon and build soil life, is in the integration of animals in our program. And I think about this, so many years of making hundreds of tons of compost and applying that to our vineyards and our gardens in the name of sustainability. And I think about all that material movement, and I feel like 90% of my job is figuring out how to move bulk materials from one side of the property to the other. And now, as we're learning how to use our livestock in order to use these little four-legged biodigesters to just go out into the fields and fertilize for us and do our mowing for us. In particular, the sheep are so well adapted here to graze the grasses on the vineyard floor. These ruminants and the grass and legume species that are on our vineyard floors have evolved together for millions of years. And I think it's time for us as farmers to be smart about climate change, is to realize we don't necessarily have the answers. We can't think ourselves out of this situation. There are things that we can do to help. But these co-evolutionary relationships between animals, grasses, plants, soil, these are way smarter than we are. And at some point we have to realize we can step aside and let those other species help us with this issue. So we're really focusing our energies on using animals better in all of our farming operations, whether it be grazing the headlands with cattle, grazing the forests with goats and pigs, and especially in the vineyards, which is more pertaining to this discussion with sheep. They're just so well adapted. So I think this is the future of viticulture, is stop all the composting, stop all buying all of the inputs that we're putting into our fields, and start using the animal species to just further this relationship with the microbiota in our soils that will help us sequester all that carbon. So that's really, I think, where we're on the edge of learning how to do all of that.
Julien, on that note, your company, Jackson Family Wines, is doing this on a really pretty massive scale. You mentioned that the company has a goal of converting all 13,000 vineyard acres to regenerative ag by 2030. Can you tell us what does that look like, and what are some of the changes you guys have made kind of company-wide across the board so far that you've seen make a difference?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think, as we think about it, and Nadine and Suzanne have really hit on some of the key aspects that are required. And when we look at it big picture, the science is increasingly demonstrating that soil carbon sequestration and how we farm ultimately can have a major impact in reversing climate change. And I think that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in that area to help us ultimately fully understand that. But the direction that is pointing looks good, and it looks promising. And for us, we're focused on these, how we farm can really kind of have these positive outcomes. And as we see it, a lot of the work that we've been doing historically with the certified sustainable programs, for example, have been, I think, a really good foundation for scaling and growing climate smart agriculture. So, in 2017, we started evaluating what we could potentially sequester through the adoption of regenerative agricultural practices, looking at compost and cover cropping and reduced tillage, animal integration, things like have been discussed. And, given the extent of our land holdings, 13,000 planted acres, round numbers, and we recognized just a massive opportunity to kind of be a part of a larger climate solution. And so we've been spending a lot of time over the past few years engaging with a number of different research partners and academic partners, UC Davis, for example, California Department of Food and Agriculture through their Healthy Soils program, to put trials into the ground and really fully understand how we can adopt and scale these activities across our different the regions within which we farm. And it's important to note, I think, for us, given that we grow in different regions and also at different price points, what we're working on trying to figure out is how we can kind of balance these things and what works at varying different levels. We by no means have an answer at this point. We are committed to learning more. And so essentially what we're going to be doing over the next few years is really kind of putting trials into the ground and understanding how we can make this transition. In regions, for example, like the Russian River Valley and Anderson Valley in Northern California, we've made a lot of advances already. And so it's taking kind of what we're learning and also learning from other farmers in the academic community and really working to grow and expand on that. But we are, I think, really excited. I mean, Suzanne mentioned, I believe, kind of the cross collaboration between soil health and water holding capacity. And as we kind of stare down the barrel of another very significant drought that is impending in California, it's looking holistically and kind of thinking in systems, as it were, to understand fully, how we can adopt these practices and how they can benefit all of us.
What sorts of measurements do you all look at? I mean, when you're thinking about these things company-wide, Julien, like what are the kind of markers for progress that you guys think are kind of the most important ones?
On the farming side or on the just kind of the overarching?
The farming side. I mean, as you're well, I don't know, maybe it's a big question, but what do you like, what are some of the kind of goals or ways you're looking at, this will have been a kind of successful experiment a year or two down the line? Sure.
So, I mean, this is kind of where we're really kind of working to figure this out. And it takes a collaborative approach, right? Because, we've got to get the winemaking teams involved. We've got to get the farming teams involved. And as we look at, because, I mean, because we grow grapes primarily for quality, right? And not necessarily for volume. There's various different aspects that we need to understand. So looking at things like, the impact of these practices on yield, on quality, how, the ageability of the wines and ultimately kind of what we get in our finished products. These are all things that we're essentially working kind of to develop criteria around. And so what we're doing over the next 3 to 5 years is we've got about 15% of our total acreage identified in different regions across Northern, Central California and Oregon to kind of to convert towards these practices so that we can really understand ultimately fully how this plays out and how we can manage most effectively.
Okay, Suzanne, we got to talk about hybrids. So upstate New York has fought for decades to gain recognition for growing high quality, world-class vitis vinifera, and a lot of quality-minded producers have tried to distance themselves from non-vinifera grapes. And now here you guys are. You have a whole wine label that's devoted to really kind of high-end hybrids and non-vinifera grape varieties. Tell us about it, and why does it matter to be thinking about non-vinifera wines from a climate change perspective?
Yeah, so I'm almost glad we're doing this virtually because I don't want the rotten tomatoes being thrown at me. because it's so much heart and soul and work. My parents and so many of their peers for the last 40 years went into building this reputation, and we finally got it. And now we're, yeah, as you said, trying to talk up hybrids. So I think part of the reason that I think it's important that we have this conversation and that we dote on our hybrids in New York State is that part of adapting to and becoming resilient to climate change is encouraging diversity in our agricultural landscapes, and diversity in many different ways throughout our society. But in the wine industry, I think we have to embrace and celebrate diversity. And that means also celebrating our hybrids and doing the very best we can with them. And so we've been experimenting with doting on a Cayuga White and doting on a Valvin Muscat and a Chambourcin over the last several years. Craig Hosbach is our winemaker, just to see how far we can push those varieties into the fine wine realm. And we've created a new line of wines called Uncharted Terroir, is a way to get the conversation going with our customers and folks out in the wine world about how climate change is affecting the terroirs of the world. And some years we're going to have polar vortex like we did in 2014, and it was minus 18 degrees at our place, and there was almost no vinifera harvest that year. But luckily we grow a number of hybrids, and we were able to make some lovely wines. And everybody got hit to some degree across the region with those temperatures, maybe not as much as the high elevation lake that we're on, but yeah, that diversity. And some years we have late frosts, and so the later blooming grapes are going to do better. And then some years we have drought, and so just having that diversity to be able to, no matter what the changing climate throws at us, have some beautiful grapes to work with.
There's such a kind of consumer perception about hybrid wines. What do you find in them as a drinker? I mean, do you think it's a huge leap for people to, start drinking the Chambourcin and Cayuga, in place of Chardonnay or Cabernet at their dinner table? Or do you think it's going to require less of a jump?
It's not either or, it's really both. So, a lot of the time I'm going to go straight for the Chardonnay or the Riesling or the Cab, but, a lot of the time I'm not making a European style dinner. I'm making Thai or Indian or something that's going to be awful with Chardonnay, and a semi-dry Cayuga is going to be delightful with that. So I think, we don't have to try and cram the round peg into the square hole. We can just celebrate them in other ways. I mean, we make a beautiful sherry out of some of the hybrids. We make some totally lowbrow sparkling wines that people love out of so it's the wine drinking public is also a lot more diverse than I think we give them credit for. So it's really up to the tastemakers and the consumers to also help broaden the conversation and broaden, because any winery in New York is going to tell you, most wineries in New York is going to tell you that they sell a lot of sweeter wines. There are a lot of people that enjoy a more diverse set of wines than I think kind of the wine intelligentsia is really celebrating. So the customers, I think, have a big role to play in asking for wines that they may not be super familiar with.
I love that. Nadine, wine growers aren't in this alone. And in fact, there's a lot of other types of agriculture out there that may not seem as sexy as wine, but that are making huge strides in thinking about their role in combating climate change. What do you think wine growers have to learn from other types of growers?
So it's such a great question, because in our previous meeting with this panel, I had mentioned that in the last several years, as we started integrating livestock into our vineyard operation, my learning curve as a viticulturist has just been like really steep, as I'm learning how to keep these animals healthy and how to keep them where I want them and keep the fences up. And I think that rangeland agriculture, and in particular, I'm going to mention Alan Savory's work with the Savory Institute, has been doing so much with carbon sequestration and regenerating soil using grazing animals. that for me as a viticulturist, I've been doing this for decades now. I feel like I'm like a new student learning how agriculture works, frankly. There's so much we can learn from other disciplines. We're not the only ones in this boat. So every agricultural discipline has something to learn from regenerative agriculture. And I think when we talk about regenerative agriculture, we have to be careful that we don't fall back on chemical means of controlling, weeds and things like that with a lower till type of agriculture, because anything that will knock back soil life is going to ultimately knock back carbon sequestration, which is really the ultimate goal. And so I think that as farmers, we need to be careful to find solutions in regenerative ag. If we're going to go with minimal tillage and use more grazing techniques and things like that, that we're adopting from other agricultural disciplines, we should be careful not to fall into that trap of doing that with chemical means, but we should learn a little bit more from those that are doing it with, with a little bit more of an eye towards keeping the soil life in the soil. And Suzanne, I just want to mention, as a grower, the idea of using hybrid varieties is just like, I wish the industry would jump on board, because our biggest issues, of course, are drought in the Pacific Northwest, drought in the early season, like this year. We're facing a very hot and dry summer, and then fungal diseases. And if we had varieties that were well adapted to the environments where they want to grow, then we wouldn't be combating diseases or pests or drought intolerance issues as much as we are by trying to grow vinifera varieties in areas that maybe they're not the best suited. So I really applaud these attempts at using the grapes that want to grow in the place that they are native. So thank you for doing all that and pushing that forward a little bit. All the growers, thank you.
Julien, I want to talk about emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, where are winemaking and viticultural enterprises most at risk of contributing to these emissions, and how would one go about trying to lessen that impact?
So I think, this conversation on regenerative agriculture is great, and it's of critical importance, but it only represents, I think, a small portion of the overarching emissions pie. So for a sense of context for us at Jackson Family Wines, we've done some analysis on what we can kind of mitigate through regenerative agricultural practices, and how soil carbon sequestration can help us with our climate goals. And, assuming we adopt these practices, assuming they sequester the CO2 and actually store it and hold it in perpetuity like we're expecting it to, that's only going to get us about 20 to 25% to our goal. And big picture, we are aiming to become climate positive by 2050, which is essentially in line with what the majority of the scientific community deems is necessary and is required. And I think this is what you're going to be hearing hopefully from the Biden administration tomorrow and next day, but also through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the United Nations Race to Zero campaign. And so these are things, international frameworks where we need to be mitigating our climate and our carbon impacts. And so if we think that, regenerative agriculture can only get us about 20 to 25% of the way there, it takes that holistic effort to look kind of beyond that as well. And for us, as we look at our emissions footprint, the top emission sources for us, and this includes our scope 1 and 2 emissions, which are our direct emissions. And these are the emissions that we as a business create through our own activities. So electricity usage, on-farm fuel usage, things like that. Those are scopes 1 and 2. And then you have scope 3 emissions, which are your indirect or your supply chain emissions. So that's things like packaging and transportation, things that we buy that we don't actually create emissions, but we create the demand for the emissions as those materials and things are developed. So for us, big picture, and most wineries that we've seen, the top emission sources are transportation, obviously, and that's made up of distribution, your fleet vehicles, your agricultural equipment, your employee commutes, your business travel. That's kind of loosely lumped into transportation. Packaging is second, which is primarily glass, and a major footprint associated with the production of and recycling of glass. Then the things that we buy, things like grapes and barrels, those have a pretty significant carbon footprint. Soil emissions, so nitrous oxide, which we've kind of discussed the other side of that on regenerative agriculture, but by applying fertilizers, you create nitrous oxide, which is, I think, 300 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So it's an area of high concern. And then stationary emissions, propane, diesel, things like that. And one of the efforts that we've taken recently, kind of at the global level, and really focusing on aggregating the voice of the wine industry towards decarbonization, is through the establishment of a group that we founded in 2019 with the Torres family of Spain, called International Wineries for Climate Action. And what IWCA does is it really kind of brings the industry together, first to measure our emissions, to understand what's driving our emissions, and to use standardized ultimately emissions calculation tools to understand where our emissions are, commit to these net zero targets by 2050 at the latest, and then work together to aggregate our voice to get to zero as quickly as possible. And ultimately, from our perspective, Jackson Family Wines, in the grand scheme of things, I think we're recognized as a leader and maybe one of the larger family-owned wine companies out there. But in the scale of global emissions, we are insignificant. And you could maybe argue that the wine industry is potentially insignificant. And yet we have this opportunity, we have this mouthpiece and this voice to really start to drive efforts towards making these wholesale changes to the economy. And it's something that one winery really can't do on its own. So IWCA, we really see that it's an amazing vehicle to aggregate our voice towards far-reaching and broad decarbonization for the industry as quickly as possible.
Suzanne, you have had a long career in clean tech, even before rejoining your family's wine business. Tell us some of the kind of most important technological additions you all have made at the business that you see are really making a difference so far.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, well, and to back up, part of the reason there's so much excitement about soil carbon sequestration and agriculture is a solution to climate change broadly is because when you do the accounting globally, food and agriculture represents about a third of the human-caused climate pollution and climate impact. So while for most of my career, everyone focused on energy. You have to get off of fossil fuels, which is true. But now finally everyone's realizing, oh my gosh, it's agriculture and land. And to the extent that most people in modern societies now have no direct contact with their food systems, we are as wineries, we are a rare part of agriculture where the customers come to our farms, they come to our vineyards, they park in our parking lots, and they kind of have that firsthand touch. So there's just this huge opportunity for gentle education. Obviously, people come not to learn about how awful our climate challenge is, but there's a lot of opportunity there. And so one of the things that we've done is we've just started to help normalize these new clean technologies. So when we first put in the electric car chargers, people asked nonstop about them, and there was a novelty and it was really strange, and how do they work? And now it's just normal. It's a plug and you plug in your car and it's totally normal. The solar panels, we get asked all the time, everything you can imagine, what happens when it hails, what happens with the snow. So a lot of the social science is showing that the key factor in adoption of these new clean technologies is not affluence, education level, it's physical proximity to someone else who's adopted these technologies. So I think that's, that's a big part of what we can do as a wine industry, is just familiarize folks with these new things. So I mentioned our geothermal heating and cooling, installed lots of insulation, lots of LEDs. This is all mature technology. We're in general not doing anything that's unproven or cutting edge. In the future, I'd really like to move towards some hydrogen, making hydrogen with excess renewables, so that we have some energy storage built in, and would love to have some hydrogen fuel cell vehicles so we don't have the charging issue that the electric vehicles do. And it does get so cold here that I would really love to have hydrogen fuel cells instead of batteries for our tractors and things. But it's going to take the industry demanding that to get the manufacturers to focus on these things. So we can't do it alone. But yeah, and then, on the vineyard side, I'm really excited about some of the new biologicals that are becoming available. We're using one that doesn't attack the mildews. It actually just elicits an immune response in the vines and makes them better able to fight off the mildew. So you don't get any of that herbicide or any of that pesticide resistance you get with something with a spray that actually attacks the mildew. So I think there's a lot of innovation both on the farming side and on the business side.
So we're in kind of our final 10 minutes here. I'm going to turn to Q&As from the Q&A section. Anyone who has more, feel free to add them in now. One question from Tamlin that I thought was interesting about the sequestration and reuse of carbon dioxide that's produced during fermentation. I mean, we're talking a lot about carbon sequestration in the vineyard, but of course, carbon dioxide is a byproduct of fermentation. Any of the three of you, can you comment on that? Is that something that's on your minds?
I can take that question because that's been something that's been on our minds for many years, and we're taking steps to work to try to figure that out. I think from an accounting standpoint, just to be clear, emissions from sequestration are technically known as biogenic, which means they're essentially created from natural systems. So they're not technically accounted for in an organization's scope 1 through 3 inventory, which, right, wrong, or indifferent, that's the way the carbon accounting currently goes. It doesn't change the fact that those are actual emissions that are coming from concentrated sources that we, I think, as an industry have a really great opportunity to capture and sequester. But from an action standpoint, I think maybe that explains to a certain degree why maybe we haven't seen as much advancement in that particular space. Although there are VOC concerns, volatile organic compound concerns with gases like ethanol that are being addressed in some regions. So it's by no means kind of a pass, as it were. But I think we see fermentation capture as a great opportunity to advance and to innovate on, and particularly because it comes from such a concentrated source at specific times during the year, right? So during harvest, we have fermentation tanks that we could theoretically capture and sequester carbon dioxide from. Other challenges exist just in terms of the types of tanks. So we do a lot of open top fermentation. So you're going to have to design and engineer a system that is able to kind of capture the CO2 as it kind of pours out and down the sides of the tank, as it were. But we are in the process, and we've been working with UC Davis on building a model and developing a pilot scale unit that we're hopefully going to be getting started on this year that actually does just that. It can kind of capture and take carbon dioxide, bubble it through a solution, and actually kind of settle the CO2 out as, not a scientist, but somebody can probably correct me, but I believe it comes out as calcium carbonate. So it's essentially, it's a solid. And then that solid can actually be reused either in construction materials or as a soil amendment. So that's something that we have in our pipeline, pardon the pun, for development over the next couple of years, but an area where we see a lot of opportunity.
That's so interesting. Okay, I'm gonna try to do this. I just clicked answer live, which I haven't done this feature on Zoom before, but Carl asks about converting from traditional conventional agriculture to organic, biodynamic, sustainable. Soils may be compacted in the process. Nadine, do you want to take this? What are some ways to think about bringing those soils back to life?
I saw that question. I question the assumption that soils would be compacted just because of a transition from one system to another. I think there's a tendency to believe that when you transition from a conventional system to an organic or biodynamic one, maybe you're driving more tractors because you're not strip spraying, so you're potentially compacting your soil that way. There's a lot to be said with leaving roots in the ground in order to combat compaction. So every time you have plant roots, whether they be grasses or legumes or trees or grapevines or whatever it is, you're going to have those air spaces available to you with the roots there. Every time we till, every time we disrupt the soil, we break up that potential carbon exudation, use compaction. And so my recommendation is try to get roots in the ground, whether or not it's through cover cropping or leaving your native vegetation and keeping it mowed short in areas where you are worried about water competition. In the Pacific Northwest, a lot of us dry farm. So that's a real big concern with keeping roots next to your grapevines in the early spring so that you have this water competition later in the summer. But we know through rangeland management that when grasses get grazed really short, their root systems also just stop growing for a period of time until they have a little bit more time that's either non-mowed or non-grazed. So one of the ways to keep roots in the ground and keep that compaction from happening is to mow your vineyard short in the early season where you want to reduce water competition. Allow those roots to stop growing for a little bit, but then as soon as the conditions are good and you have water back in your soil from the rains, you can get that root growth immediately and to open up those soils again. So I think being really careful and mindful about how you treat your soil can help you with compaction issues. And I don't think that's necessarily an organic discussion or a biodynamic discussion or a sustainable or conventional discussion. I think as growers, we just have to be careful about soil management altogether.
Okay, last question, Suzanne. I want to go to this. An anonymous attendee asks, are we just confusing consumers? Like, how do we, there's so many words that get thrown around. Some of them overlap, some of them don't. Some of them maybe sound like they mean something, but they don't. And you, I think, have spoken so articulately about the kind of opportunity the wine industry here has to spread the message. Are we confusing people, and how do we stop confusing people?
Yeah, so, I mean, on the one hand, sustainability is, and agriculture, and it's all just inherently complicated. So if consumers really want to dive in, we have to be ready with the information they need. Most consumers, I think, we recognize aren't going to have the time or the bandwidth to dig into the details. So they need some tool and clear language to be able to understand these things. And that's where I'm super appreciative to you guys for hosting this conference. I'm super appreciative to Sam and New York Winegrape for being willing to host the sustainability effort and work on a certification scheme. And I think, there's just so many trade-offs in sustainability. And, there is no one size fits all for these practices, but there's also no one size fits all certification scheme, but there can be way too many, such that it becomes very confusing. So I do think that we have to keep collaborating to make sure that we have, to make sure we minimize the potential confusion as much as possible for the consumer and make it as clear and concise as possible. And yeah, I don't know, does that answer your question? I mean, I think there's no way to avoid the complexity, but there are ways to mitigate the level of confusion among our consumers.
Well, that's great. And we're running up on our time here, but would any of you panelists like to add a kind of final parting word? Anything you want to leave the group with?
I think, Suzanne, I think you're right. I think it's a mistake for the industry to rely on certification labels to describe our sustainability efforts, because we're not one size fits all. But my parting words here are like, let's try to explain what it is that we're doing in our businesses to our consumers the best way we can in terms of individual practices, and maybe not with catch-all labels. And then the other thing is, we all should learn how to save water and grow a little bit of food. I think these are the most important things that are going to come face us coming together in the future. We're agronomists after all, and we do grow grapes and we make wine, but wine and food are so interconnected. We need to start bridging that gap and tackling the food system the best way that we know how. So those are my little takeaways.
Any other parting words, Julien?
I would just say for anybody sitting on the webinar who wants to know how they can take action, particularly on climate, IWCA is a really, really great vehicle to do that. I think we've created a framework there to really kind of emphasize measurement, action, and prioritization around the things that matter the most, and really giving the wine industry a voice on climate. So we'd love to have any committed wineries join our cause and amplify our efforts. And I just also want to thank everybody for the opportunity to be on the panel.
Suzanne, any last words?
Yeah, I would put out a plea to all of your peers in the world of journalism. We have such talented storytellers, and wineries, owners, especially the little guys, are trying to do so many different things. It's a full-time job to be a storyteller, to translate these complicated issues. So I would just put out a plea to all of the folks that are our mouthpieces and our voices to the consumers, to take the time to spend time with us, come out to our wineries and learn about these sustainability efforts so that you can translate them to the consumer. There was a lot of talk about worry about greenwashing yesterday, but we should also worry that the folks that are working really hard to do the right things aren't getting the support they need to keep going. So I want to just flag that as well. I'm less worried about the greenwashing than I am about actually helping everyone do it right and supporting those who are trying.
Well, amen to that, and heard. And I think we certainly, those of us who write about all that you guys do, have a role to play in this too. And I take that seriously, and I know a lot of others do. So thank you so much to all of you. I think this was a really fascinating discussion. All three of you are doing such fascinating things, and I know everyone here is grateful to you for sharing some of your knowledge. Allison, any final words we need to leave them with before we sign off?
No, I just want to thank you, Esther, Julien, Suzanne, Nadine. I really agree with you, Esther, that we're in a hopeful moment, especially after hearing more about what you all are doing to be part of the solution. And I know so many vintners and growers are working on climate resiliency. I also want to echo Sam's comment that I think this is an area in which we can really continue to work together as our United States wine industry and with wine regions around the world. So it's, I think, a really exciting area for research and collaboration. So thank you all for being with us.